All right, welcome to Module 3. This module is focused on a very broad and very important subject, the Constitution. There is a lot of material to cover in this module, and the other module for this week is federalism, which also is very complex. So, this is going to be a challenging week. Let's embrace the challenge. Let's have a good week of learning this stuff. Broadly speaking, all American government textbooks focus on a couple of broad areas when they talk about the Constitution. First, colonization and the factors that led the colonies to seek independence from Great Britain. Second, having won independence, the problems that existed under the Articles of Confederation that began creating tension and problems within the states and between the states, leading to calls for a constitutional convention. Third, the Constitution and the ratification debates. And fourth, the basic principles of the Constitution itself. So if you ever asked yourself, why did the framers adopt a federal system of government, you can kind of get the answer in this chapter and in the next chapter. The British North American colonies, with the exception of Canada, which the British took from France as the spoils for winning the French and Indian Wars, which lasted from 1754 to 1763. They had they had a deal of sorts. The colonists had a deal of sorts with the British. The colonists acknowledged British rule and Britain's right to kind of manage commerce between the colonies and other parts of the world. And the British, in return, extended to the colonies extensive autonomy in terms of managing their internal affairs. That deal of sorts started sort of out of necessity. North American colonization began under James I, who ruled from 1567 to 1725. And it was in the early 17th century. I think the first colonies were planted in 1607. The British at that time were sort of a middle tier power, with France and Spain having far larger economies and far more formidable militaries. The British believed that colonization was essential for their national security, but their colonies didn't strike gold like the Spanish. And as a result, they adopted a strategy I like to characterize as colonization on the cheap. Granting the colonies extensive right to self-governance actually helped alleviate the cost of sustaining the colonies. Another important factor, the British used colonization politically as a sort of pressure valve, encouraging fractious religious sects like the Puritans to travel to the New World, where the hope was that they would cause less trouble. Similarly, Maryland was established as a royal charter in 1637 as a colony for British Catholics who were a distinct minority in England at the time and whose loyalties to the British crown were suspect, because you always had rival Catholic British lines looking to kind of take over. So the deal between the crown and the colonies held up for about 150 years. And over the course of those 7+ generations, the colonies established distinct political cultures and became very protective of their autonomy. So there were two problems that began creating tension between the crown and the colonies. One issue was westward expansion. The colonies were intent on expanding beyond the Appalachian Mountains. In fact, Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia all had expanded into the areas that are now, Tennessee and Alabama and Kentucky. So they wanted to expand beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The British knew that there were numerous warlike Native American tribes in the Ohio Valley, and they didn't want the colonies to blunder into another full-scale war that the British would ultimately have to fight. So in the 1760s, the British basically said no westward expansion, which greatly upset the colonists who had already kind of begun imbibing this sense of manifest destiny. The other issue was the massive debt that the British incurred over the course of defending the North American colonies during the French and Indian Wars. It really was a global war. The British and the French fought, in the Pacific. They fought in Africa. They fought in the colonies. Of course, the North American colonies were the main sort of arena of that conflict. But it caused the British to take on a great amount of debt, and the British decided that the North American colonies should help defray the costs of the war in the form of higher taxes, which the colonists, needless to say, didn't like. One important aspect of the run-up to the Revolutionary War was the formation of committees of correspondence, which amounted to, people in all the colonies making lists of the various abuses that that British agents in the colonies did to try and suppress colonial unrest and protests. Many of those abuses were, chronicled in the Declaration of Independence as kind of a bill of particulars that amounted to a justification for the colony's decision to break away from Britain. I'm going to fast forward through the Revolutionary War itself. Suffice to say that the colonies were able to raise the costs of British occupation sufficiently to cause second thoughts. And eventually the surrender of Lord Cornwallis's army in Yorktown, Virginia, created a strategic environment where British continuation of the war was simply unsustainable. Their fears were that continuing to invest in that war would open them up to invasion from the mainland. So the colonies found themselves independent, and in 1781, that meant that there were 13 separate sovereign states, loosely allied through a confederal agreement known as the Articles of Confederation. Because it was a confederation, each state was sovereign and independent, and very quickly problems began to emerge. As I noted, they were expanding westward, and oftentimes conflicting with one another over, the right of expansion. As a government, the Articles were ineffective. The Continental Congress lacked the authority to levy taxes and had to rely on contributions from the states, who frequently, just declined to make their contributions. The problems got to the point where various political leaders held a convention in Annapolis in 1786, where they proposed a constitutional convention. So roughly 5 years following independence, the ineffectiveness of the Articles of Confederation was further demonstrated with a rebellion of rural farmers in western Massachusetts in the summer of 1787, known as Shays' Rebellion. The revolt was brought on by a Massachusetts law passed because of the state's faltering financial situation. Massachusetts was one of those governments that had invested heavily in supporting the Revolutionary War. The law basically mandated the immediate repayment of all debts owed to the state in gold. This was a law that fell particularly heavily on low-income farmers, and the problem was not simply that immediate repayment was not feasible, but that their farms were going to be subject to forfeiture. The fact that the right to vote was conditional on ownership of property meant that for many western Massachusetts farmers, not only would they lose their livelihoods, their homes, but also the franchise, their right to vote. The state's inability to marshal sufficient force to put down the rebellion was shocking to political leaders in other states. Ultimately, a mercenary army of other state militias successfully suppressed the rebellion. But the event had a galvanizing effect on the delegates to the Constitutional Convention that would begin meeting that summer, right? So I want to point out at this point that anyone who thinks that the Constitution's framers were a bunch of revolutionaries who included, for example, the Second Amendment so that people could rise up and overthrow a tyrannical government, they're simply mistaken about the founding generation, members of whom drafted the Constitution and the Bill of Rights a few years later. The framers were profoundly mistrustful of their fellow citizens, and in particular, they had no faith in the judgment of fellow Americans who lacked independent means. And so, the whole point of the Constitution was to create a central government strong enough to put down revolutions from below. So the notion that the generation that drafted the Constitution were a bunch of wild-eyed radicals is simply wrong. There were 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention, representing 12 of the 13 colonies. Rhode Island's government had been seized by a bunch of populist farmers, and they sent no delegates. For the most part, all the delegates favored strengthening the government, but a number of the delegates contemplated going well beyond the original mandate of the convention, which was simply to amend and improve the Articles of Confederation. In fact, on the opening day of the convention, James Madison, a delegate from Virginia, offered a proposal that would become known as the Virginia Plan that would have clearly replaced the Articles with a much more powerful and much more centralized government, actually a government that would have looked a lot more like the government of Great Britain. Broadly speaking, there were two serious divisions at the convention between those delegates representing the large states versus the smaller states, and those delegates representing the slave-holding states versus the northern states, where slavery and indentured servitude had effectively died out. The debates tended to reflect the mistrust the delegates felt, both towards those people from the larger states, but also mistrust from the delegates from the slaveholding states towards the free states. Their fears were that if they joined in a common government, that the institution of slavery would be outlawed. So the debates at the convention produced two significant compromises. The Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, adopted bicameralism, with a lower chamber elected by proportional representation, and a Senate represented by two members each for each state, as a way of placating the concerns of the smaller states, who would be, their fears were that they would be swamped by the greater voting strength of the larger states. Similarly, the 3/5 Compromise ameliorated the fears of the slaveholding states, that the northern states would interfere with their domestic institutions, and that compromise allowed the continued importation of slaves for another 20 years until 1808, and allowed slaves to be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. The point of that was basically to increase the voting power of the slaveholding states so that there would be no realistic way that slavery could be outlawed legislatively. That is a compromise that we continue to to suffer from to some extent, because again, we originated in inequality, and we are persisting in that to some extent. Ultimately, the Constitution was ratified. Let's spend a minute laying out the primary constitutional principles. First, you have the separation of powers, which reflected the framers' concerns about concentrated powers. They wanted a stronger government. They did not want a tyrannical government. So the Constitution creates a separate legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judiciary, who exercise exclusive jurisdiction over their respective zones of government. And again, violating the separation of powers is one of those constitutional things that would cause the Supreme Court to strike down a proposed action. Another important principle that interacts with the separation of powers is the system of checks and balances, which means that one branch of government can stop the other branch of government from taking unpopular or unconstitutional actions. For example, the president can veto a proposed law that might violate people's rights. Likewise, the Supreme Court can strike down a law or presidential action that is deemed a violation of some constitutional principle or individual due process, or that denies people equal protection under the law. Another important constitutional principle is federalism, which we'll address in greater detail in the next module. Federalism refers to a system of government in which sovereignty is divided between a national government, which enjoys exclusive jurisdiction over broad issues like coining money and protecting the nation's borders, and then smaller state governments, which have jurisdiction over matters directly related to providing for the health, safety, and moral education of its citizens. The federal and state governments also have concurrent powers, which are shared jointly, such as the power of taxation. The other principle I'll mention is the Supremacy Clause, which was established in Article 6 of the Constitution, and basically declares that in instances of conflict between federal and state laws, that the federal law shall prevail. Lastly, the framers created a two-track process for amending the Constitution and a two-track process for ratifying proposed amendments. The amendment process was not designed to be easy, which explains why there have only been 27 amendments over 235 years. To propose an amendment, either 2/3 of both houses of Congress or a convention must be called by 2/3 of the state legislatures. That latter method has never been employed because look what happened the last time we had a constitutional convention. To ratify an amendment, either 3/4, the text is mistaken on that, 3/4 of the state legislatures, which is currently 38 states, or 3/4 of the states through special state conventions, have to ratify. And that's only been employed once with the 21st Amendment in 1933. All right, I think I've gone way over my time. I might try to post another video addressing the influences on the Americans who drafted the Constitution. And as well, there is an assignment on the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debates. As always, if there's anything in my presentation that confuses you, or if there is anything in the text that you don't understand, then please ask a question in the weekly discussion or email me directly. Let's have a great week.